Thank you again for collaborating and sharing Torah with as many people as possible. And as always, we try to bring the Parsha to life and some direct experience that we can take from the Parsha itself. And I thought that today we do a little extra and bring a little bit of Adar or Purim, and I'll do it the way I will, and Reuben will follow and do the same. And then, of course, we open up the questions and answers afterwards. So this week's Torah, we're going to jump right in if that's okay. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Mishpatim. Mishpatim is the word that describes one of the particular mitzvahs. There are three kinds of mitzvahs. Mishpatim means judgment and law, and this parsha deals with a lot of specificness of damages. If someone damages, deals with slavery, a lot of details, almost boring, and almost very little that we can directly connect with, as I'll share with you soon. But what there seemed to be a little bit of a downer. Last week we had Yisrael and we got the 10 Commandments. That's pretty powerful stuff. And all of a sudden we the and Lord your God, God, very, very big, infinite Hashem, becoming partnerships and making this world a better for tooth, kind of, descends from that great moment. So what's going on over here? So first of all, Mishpatim means judgment. There's three types of mitzvahs. Chukim, Eidusa, Mishpat. Chukim are the type of mitzvahs that have no reasoning behind it. It's called a chuk. And Eidus is a type of mitzvah which, once the Torah tells us why we do it, we understand it. Like, for example, since God rests on the seventh day, we keep Shabbos and we rest on the seventh day. So we can understand that. And then, of course, Mishpat is basically things that are obvious. Don't kill, don't steal. But still, we have to have this in place. And the short reason to give you the answer, not we're going to talk about this, but just to give the quick answer to the question of why do we have Mishpatim, followed right by, the Aseret HaDibros, and Rashi addresses this and says, just as those were given by Sinai, this is also given by Sinai. Or it's even the basic things that you think is totally comprehensible from your own understanding, we should appreciate it as if it's the word of Hashem. It has a much more significance. It's not that we don't kill, we don't steal, because I understand that's not a good thing to do. Because you can find countries, perhaps, that they have lax, maybe even inner cities in our own country, that their laws are lax on this. So that can't be the reason why we don't. But it has to be of a higher purpose, a higher understanding. Now, I want to talk about a unique discussion that takes place based on our parsha, and of course, the Mishnah, if I can quote it over here. The Mishnah in Besetta's Baba Kama talks about it. There are four, what we call father archetype of damages, Arba Avos Nezikin, which come from this week's parsha as well, and we talk about different damages. So the Gemara, the Mishnah talks about it based on the verses in Shemot, which is chapter 21 and verses 18. It goes on through quite a few verses. And I want to share this with you so it's a takeaway we can bring into our own experience and not just feel, wait a second, the Beis HaMikdash, these laws, how does it connect to me? How's it talking to me? Torah is Melashon Hara'ah. If I can't figure out how Torah is talking to me in my life, then I'm missing it. So we're not just repeating words like zombies. We have to inculcate it into our own experience. So it says there's four types of nizikin damages. One is called hashar, which literally means an ox, vahabar, and a pit. Vahamava is a machlokas, but we're going to go with the one that says that it means man, a human being. Vahabe'er, and it means already a fire. And so these are the four archetypes. They each have a different experience of their little. A shar, for example, if you have an ox and it gores once and it gores twice and it gores three times, okay, it has to be responsible for this particular ox. It knows that it likes to damage. It has to have bigger fences. Maybe it has the leash, I'm not sure, but it has to be more responsible for it. And same thing with the sheriff. You had a pit, or you made a pit and someone fell into it. So it's explained that these four different categories truly represent four different really experiences of our own ability to damage, of the human experience to damage. And we compare these four to psychological experiences that every human being goes through. For example, the first part, in terms of when we see it in terms of an animal, we know for those who've been to our class a few times, the Alter Rebbe goes at great length and talks about the nefesh habahamis. We have each have an animal soul. That animal soul is instinctive to survive. That's its nature. And just as an animal who's looking to survive will damage something in order to survive, sometimes we take on that expression also. We don't need to, because we also have a nefesh elokis. We have a higher appreciation and purpose. But sometimes the animal side of us gets the better of us, and we act instinctively versus rationally versus morally. So that's something that we must be careful about. In addition to the animal default position, we also have the pit. The pit represents the part of us that can sometimes feel empty. And because of that emptiness, that allows us to go into a certain level of, creates paralysis and sometimes even depression, my worthiness, self-loathing. We know this is a big topic in today's conversation. Certainly during pandemic, I get plenty of calls from the young adult space. People are alone and they ask themselves, what is their self-worth? This is reflective of the pit that we can each all have a certain experience, and we have to be careful about. Now, in many ways, well, let me continue and then we'll come back to it. The third one is the human experience. What's the human experience and how could that be damaging? There are many times that because we feel that we are human, because we feel we're someone of intellect, that can be the better of us. How come we see so many people with such great charisma, great skills, great intelligence fall from grace? Whether they make personal mistakes, whether they make communal mistakes, they take advantage of their power. It comes from one place only. They get lost in their own intelligence. They buy their own script, so to speak, and they believe they're infallible. Anyone who touches any element of power and makes that mistake is extremely vulnerable. I remember before I moved to Boston a long time ago, my father warned me, not that I was ever at risk of feeling too great, but in case he said, you make it big out there, he says, Mashe, just remember one thing. You always have to listen to your wife, who'll remind you of who you really are. He says the whole world's going to tell you you're great, you're great, you're great. You're lucky, Baruch Hashem, you have a wife who loves you and will keep you grounded and tell you who really you are. Why? Because sometimes you can get to your head, you have a big event and this, that, and people say how wonderful you are. You actually can buy into that. It's not that it's not okay to take a compliment, but it depends where we go with it. And we see many times, not to personalize this, where many great leaders, unfortunately, even rabbis, can abuse their position for things that are not proper, not healthy. Why? Because that's the danger of the human experience. We see it with cult leaders, we see it with politicians, although the word politician doesn't have the same meaning it had 30 years ago. So, it's almost like a given when you say the word politician. But I think you know what I'm talking about. So that's the one thing, that's number 3 in terms of the human experience. And of course, the fourth one we have is the idea of a fire. What's fire? Fire is a personal element of, there's something that we say, there's a certain rage. I couldn't help myself. I was forced to, right? Some will say, if anyone who's caved on a diet knows that feeling, right? I couldn't help myself. There was a cupcake left in the kitchen. Nobody was around. I was starving and I had no choice. I had to eat it. A certain fire that takes over. And this idea of fire, I remember as a yeshiva boy in Crown Heights, when sadly there was a shooting, you may remember this, of Ari Halberstam. Now they built the Jewish Children's Museum in his memory, actually, in Kingston Avenue. And he was part of a motorcade that was following the Rebbe when the Rebbe was in the hospital at that time. This must have been 1992, 93. And there was assassination attempt actually against the Rebbe, and the van that followed the Rebbe veered off, and the terrorists went after the van and not after the Rebbe and shot into the van, injuring several and killing Nebuch Rahman al-Islam, a carbon Ari Halberstam. Of course, the defense attorney for I think his name was Rashid Baz, was this Arab terrorist, was of course a nice Jewish guy by the name of William Kunstler, who's already Olav Shalom, famous lawyer. And what was the defense? Rage. He was upset about how Palestinians were being treated, how this was being treated. That was a defense position. Of course, it didn't hold up in court, but I remember even the idea that someone should say rage, as if that can go ahead and qualify anyone's behavior for any reason. So we have to bring it back. We have over here 4 different categories of which our Parsha deals with, and sometimes, obviously, on the Pshat level, is dealing with certain animals that gore, but on another deeper level, it's something that we can take into our own life and our own experience in terms of the things that we need to be careful for, because we are also capable of this sort of damage. So as a refresher, the first one is the animal instinct that we have in ourselves. We also have the one to be the pit, which represents this level of passivity or self-loathing. And of course, we have the human being, not to get ahead of ourselves intellectually and think that we are the top. And of course, the fire, which is more the instinctive rage that sometimes takes us over. There's a lot more to be said on this, but I wanted to add one more teaching in the Parsha, and I think it's better that we bring into another teaching, and then maybe we'll come back to this after during Q&A. This is a classic. I'm sure Reuven is familiar with this one, which we also have in this week's portion, and I think it's important that we all learn this very, very special Torah. And the reason why I'm sharing this with everybody today is because in addition to the teaching of the Torah, it happens to be re-quoted in a book called Hayom Yom. And the Hayom Yom happens to be today, the 28th of Shvat. 28th, for those who don't know, is Koach. Koach means power. And in today's Hayom Yom, we have this beautiful teaching from the Holy Baal Shem Tov. What does he say? You could take a look in the... I'm going to try to do this. Let's see if I get fancy. Can you see that shared screen? Hang on a second. Can you see it?
Yep.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So great. So what we have here is chapter 24. This is in today's Torah portion. And we have Pasuk 5. I'm going to read you the verse and its pshat level, and then we're going to go into its deeper meaning. And then you could see how when we look at the Torah, we should see it not just on its pshat level, but also on its remez, drush, and sod, and how it relates to our own personal life. So check this out. Kisira chamar sainecha. You see the donkey of your enemy. Roivetz tachas Mashe is burdened under its burden or its load. V'chadalte me azav loi, and you considering to refraining from helping him. Azav tazav imay. You should certainly help him. That's the verse. That's a literal translation. A lot of questions on this. How does the Torah know what's in the mind of the person walking by his enemies? And why does it have to repeat it? Why did you say if you see your enemy, you should help him? No, it has to go into the psychological reading of the person that maybe in your mind you were thinking about helping and not helping him. You should certainly help him. It's an interesting language. Baal Shem Tov takes us into a whole different experience. He says, Kisira chamar seinecha. Chamar comes from the word earthiness. Your body is representative of your chomer. So when you see your own chamar that's being burdened, seinecha, by your enemy, it doesn't like the fact that, why does it hate the body? Because it doesn't like that there's a part inside you that wants to connect to something higher. The disposition of every single Jewish soul is that it wants to connect to its creator. That's the way it's hardwired. There's not a lot we can do about that. We can just suppress it, we can ignore it, but at some point everybody's going to have to deal with this idea of this voice, internal voice that wants to connect to something deeper. And for that very reason alone, the body, the instinctive body, the animal body, which we spoke about in the first part of the class, is constantly pushing this soul and suppressing it. It's on top of it. It becomes a burden. So it says, Roivetz tachas Mashe, it's under this burden. And God intended that the body be refined. And over here, you have too much on the burden of this Torah, of this yoke, is too much on it. So a person can very easily say, you know what? Let me forget about it. Let me recoil. Let me just allow and go through the motions that I'm supposed to do. I'll hit the highlights of my Judaism. Tradition, tradition, tradition. My parents did it. I'll do it. Hopefully my kids will do it somewhat. And we move on. And so the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov says, no, don't get stuck with the fact that there seems to be a burden. You have to push back and you have to push forward in terms of ultimately taking off the burden. You should certainly refrain when you think about refraining from helping because it's too difficult to take that challenge on in your life. It says, Azav Tazav Ima, you should certainly move forward and try to lift up. And when we say lift up, what does that mean? It means by removing some of the things that are in the way of allowing this connection that we could have. And for everybody, it's different. Ultimately, I believe in today's time, it's what we call time management. We get too lost up in TikTok. We get too, busy with, now we have Clubhouse, Baruch Hashem, a new social media presence in our world that we have to contend with. Everybody's busy with different things going on in their life, but ultimately they're not allowing this connection. Azev tazav imay. Don't beat yourself up in terms of why this load is on your head. Simply lift yourself up. Lift yourself up. Why? Because to be proud of this connection you have, to embrace the connection you have. Don't think of yourself as Judaism as something that you got to do, but it's something that you get to do, right? And as long as we see it that way, so it's azev taziv imay, you will certainly be able to lift yourself up. And so from this, I'm going to segue into Adar and Purim. We'll take 2 more minutes, and I'm going to pass the mic to Reuven. Tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh Adar. Adar, we know the highlight of Adar is Purim, but from the whole Adar, it's Marbin B'Simcha. Tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh, even B'Shin Nichnas Adar. Before you get to Adar, you already have this idea of bringing in Simcha. What's the greatest way of Simcha? What's the greatest Simcha we can have? What's the greatest joy we can have? Ultimately, the greatest joy we can have, I believe, is our ability to know, to feel completely that we are connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're connected to something greater than ourselves, that we are not alone in this world. We're connected with each other on this class. We're connected to our family members. We're connected to our spouses if we have them. God willing, for those who need them, they should be connected to their spouses and Mirza Hashem soon. Anytime we feel a connection, but we're not feeling isolated, that there's joy in that. That's the idea of joy, is that you're with other people. Now it's a little bit trickier. We have to go on Zoom and this and that and be a little more creative perhaps, but it doesn't take away from the ability or the reality of being connected to something higher. What takes away from joy? Obviously, this sense of being alone, the sense of being distant from our Creator and distant from each other. So what's the whole idea of Purim? What's the whole idea of Adar? What are we trying to obliterate? What does Haman represent? What does Amalek represent? We know Amalek represents Suffolk. It's the Gematria Suffolk also. It means doubt. What's the doubt? The doubt to think, God forbid, for 1 second that you're alone. You can't be alone. How could you possibly be alone? If you have a soul inside you, then you're part of something greater. You're part of God. Comes Amalek, says there. All of you don't actually have a deeper connection. If you were to breathe again, you can learn Torah with each other, see each other. That alone is azev taziv imay. Then you're certainly getting connected. And when you feel connected to something higher, that alone is a reason for simcha. That is alone a reason to lift yourself up, because this at this point it's not a burden anymore. So that's the ultimately idea of hopefully connecting a little bit of the parsha, of seeing an insight to the parsha that we can apply to our lives within the month of Adar coming tomorrow night. And it should be the whole Adar. I'll always conclude with a blessing. May we never feel alone. We should always be connected to our higher source, our higher power, our soul. And may it only bring us joy to each and every single one of us. And may this Adar be the ultimate v'nahapachu, not just the pandemic to no pandemic time, everybody. It's not quite what I want it to be. We're warming up, but will suffice for now for the L'chaim. Okay, Reuven, some comments, some feedback.
Since this is the 28th, we want to wish Mashe Yeshakeach.
Nice.
And I'm glad he was talking about the gore and the ox, because for me, gore reminds me of when the Democrats lost the election, because the candidate did not gore enough, and Beli Neder, he would have won. But since Nader took off so many of the votes, he lost in Florida. So there is a connection, not always available to the eye. Focusing on the Parsha. The beginning of this Parsha is either quite embarrassing or quite edifying, because it starts off with the institution of slavery. That's the opening of Mishpatim. And the opening line of Rashi is Ve'ela HaMishpatim, to underscore the linkage between what happened at Sinai and it's working out in Mishpatim. How does Mishpatim connect with Sinai? Because the opening line of the 10 statements, the Decalogue, which is called in English, which is really a misnomer, 10 Commandments, the opening line says, I am the Lord thy God, who took thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So if I liberated you from slavery, how come the Bible has slaves? How come the Bible even permits slavery? That's in one sense a big embarrassment, because it sounds like it's a contradiction of the opening line of the Aseret Dibrot. I liberated you, and what are we talking about now? Slaves. That's the embarrassing part. The edifying part is how slaves are treated. In that sense, they're beginning to undermine the institution of slavery. And what is the opening part worried about? It's not worried about enmity between the slave and the master. It is worried that the slave gets so attached to his master and his wife that he doesn't want to leave being a slave. So the opening is really not much so much about slavery as trying to prevent a person from becoming an eternal slave. Well, then how did he become a temporary slave? So according to Chazal, apparently most Hebrew slaves were not really slaves, they were indentured servants. I mean, they owed a debt. Let's say they stole, had to pay back double, don't have the money. So what do? They work off their debt for 6 years. That's not exactly slavery. That's indentured servants. They are indentured. They pay off and all of their debt. Now, remarkable about this is the limitation. The limitation stops at the end of 6 years, which means no matter how much money you owe, let's say you owe in the millions, and let's say your work is only worth in the thousands, we cannot keep you indentured more than 6 years. So there's a limit regardless of how much you owe. The second limitation is normally if you own a slave, you own two things. I own the slave's body and I own the slave's time. Comes along the Parshat and says, you don't really own the slave's body. If you beat him up and knock out a tooth or an eye, he goes free, which means his body is not yours. Well, then if I'm his master and I paid all the money, at least I own his time. Comes along the Torah and says, no, every seventh day, it says in the Aseret Dibrot, the Decalogue, the slave gets off 1 day a week. If a slave gets off 1 day a week, and I cannot beat him up intensely to make him work, then the question is, do I really own him? So we have the institution of slavery, but we're undermining a real slave because he retains ownership over his body and he retains some ownership over his time. In that sense, you can almost understand, well, some people would prefer slavery. And then it says, if the master gives him a wife, if he comes with his wife, that's his. If his master gives him a wife, then it belongs to the master. Then at the end of 6 years, the person has to choose. So apparently, the Torah would like him to go free. But whether the master gave me a wife or not, I can become attached to her. And if the master does not beat me up and gives me off 1 day a week and gives me 3 square meals a day, that's a pretty good life, especially for impoverished people in antiquity. So what does it say? It's remarkable. V'im amari yomar ha'eved ahafti adonai. What happens in the 6 years? The slave says, I love my master. I'm attached to him. We get along wonderfully. Why not have the security of slavery, especially since he can't beat me up? He gives me off a whole day a week. Why should I join the impoverished of the world? Maybe I'll starve outside. So when it comes to freedom versus security, what does he choose? He chooses security. Now, there's a fascinating expression that Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, coined. He said, L'homme est condamné à la liberté. that man is condemned to be free. He said, if you look at human nature, people don't desire to be free. They are condemned to be free. They're forced. And this is apparently the reality behind this. Otherwise, why would a person choose to remain in slavery? And the Torah says, well, if he does choose, what do we do? So remarkably was, first he has to come to Elohim. And the Chazal in the Torah translate that word, which is normally a divine epithet, as referring to judges. Meaning, he does not retain his slavery unless he makes a public proclamation in court. We don't trust the master to say, oh, my slave loves the situation. He has to be freely say it in court. We have to hear it before we do it. Now he comes to court and he says, I know the 6 years is up. I know I've paid off my debt, but I like the security and have to choose between security and the dangers of freedom. I choose security. So what do? According to the Torah, we mark his ear. Now, what is remarkable is the explanation that the rabbis provide. Why the ear? Why bore a hole in his ear? And they provide two explanations. One is the reason he's a slave is because he transgressed the commandment, thou shalt not steal. He has to pay double. His debts are so great, he was forced to sell himself into slavery. The second explanation of boring the ear is that ear is bored because it did not attend to the verse which says, Avdai atem, you are my servants. That is, God liberated you from Egypt in order you could serve God. And a person who's a slave is exempt from many mitzvot. So he's choosing human mastery over divine freedom. Remarkable. So what do? We bore his hole. And the expression is, Porek me'alav ol machut shamayim, v'kibel alav ol basar v'dam. He's rejected divine authority and replaced it by human authority. And therefore, what do? We bore the ear, did not command him that I liberated you to be my servants, not the servants of humanity. Now, it's a remarkable idea. It means, according to Judaism, to choose slavery is an anathema. A person has an obligation to live up to the message of the Exodus. And what's the message of the Exodus? I made you free, because only free people can serve me. So the liberation from Pharaoh was a precondition for the worship of God. Now, what have you done? You've rejected the Exodus, which means, in a sense, according to the formulation of Chazal, you rejected divine authority. And the divine authority demands that you be free. But your desire for security overruns this. So what happens? We bore a hole in his ear. You have given up freedom, and therefore you're publicly marked man. Kind of a stronger statement about the desirability of freedom than, as it were, cursing those who reject freedom and choose slavery. Then it says the last two words, va'avdo le'olam. Now, le'olam literally means forever. But according to Chazal, le'olam means until the master dies, or until the Yovel, the Jubilee year. Now, the Jubilee year comes every 50 years. So if he was sold into slavery, let's say year 40, and he worked for 6 to 7 years, there's only 3 or 4 years left. That's interesting, but that's very much, we have this elsewhere with regard to Arei Miklat, cities of refuge. What's even more interesting is if the master dies, which is a little bit like when you go to the cities of refuge, when the Kohen Gadol dies, a person also goes free. But I think it's even more important, meaning you're attached to your master. You've lived with him for years. He may be the master, you may be the slave, but domestic slavery sometimes resulted in loyalty and friendliness. This would unlikely be the case of the child of the master who took you over. He will start treating you as a slave, not as what? A trusted servant. Therefore, Chazal, with great insight in my opinion, says if the master dies, he cannot hand you down in a Yerusha to his children. That is, a human being cannot be a hand-me-down. Remarkable. So what we have here is a strange phenomenon of the acceptance of the institution of slavery. That seems to be the economic reality of antiquity. But adopting a policy of amelioration. That is, how do you undo the ideology of slavery while allowing for the institution of slavery because it met a need? That is, a person robbed owes a lot of money. What are you going to do? Throw him into debtor's prison like they did in England? Then nobody gets paid off. In the meantime, you throw him into debtor's prison, and what do you create? An enemy of society. So what does the Torah suggest? Sell him as an indentured servant. And then, remarkably, the real danger of indentured servitude is some servants are treated so well, they acquire a loyalty to their master, and they choose that over loyalty to God. It's an amazing institution, what ancient slavery was all like. Now, this brings me to the second point, which Mashe emphasized, and he gave a Hasidic interpretation to it, and I want to complement it by the Parshat interpretation. It's one of the most remarkable lines in the Torah. That is chapter 23, verse 4. If you come across the ox of your enemy, and I'm going to put the two together. You come across the ox of your enemy, or his ass, chamoro. I say the word ass. Most people say the word donkey. That's because they don't understand English. In English, an ass is a donkey. A butt, B-U-T, is an arse, A-R-S-E. The trouble is, it comes from the Irish in Boston. And the Irish in Boston do not pronounce the R. So no Irish graduate from high school has ever gone to Harvard. Some have gone to Harvard. It's a big difference. Also, the Irish have a word called baloney, which is a little bunch of bull. But since they don't pronounce the R, it comes out a bunch of baloney. So instead of having baloney, which is a bunch of bull, we end up with a replacement for salami. Remarkable. Okay? In any case, it says, if you come across the ox of your enemy, or that of his ass, and he's wandering, which means he's lost his way, what do you got to do? You got to return it to him. Now, come on. When's the last time you did that? In other words, you see a guy you really hate. He's your enemy. He's called oivcha. Next verse is sinacha, which means not only your enemy, you hate him. Now, if something happens to your enemy, you would gloat over anything which went wrong. He lost his house. He lost his money. You'd say, boy, he got exactly what he deserved. And you would gloat over it. Comes along the Torah and says, what? No. If this ox is lost and it belongs to your enemy, you got to return it. Now think about this. To return a donkey or an ox is not done in 30 seconds. That could take a whole day's work. First, he's got to find out where the owner is. Secondly, he's got to take a donkey, which are not exactly always follow your rules, and bring it back. So now you wasted a whole day because the Torah said you do it. And what does it emphasize? Not anybody's ox. It's not the regular mitzvah of Hashavat Avidah, the requirement to return a lost object, but specifically what? That of your enemy. Now look at the next verse. Ki tireh chamor sinacha. Now you see the chamor of your one who you hate. Rovetz tachat masa'o. It's burdened by it and fell down, or about to fall down. You're not sure. What are you supposed to do? Stop what you're doing. And it says, Azov tazov imo. You are obliged to help him out. You're not obliged to help out the donkey on your own. But if you see your enemy helping him out, you got to do what? Join him. Now think of the emotional situation. I hate this guy. And his donkey is falling down. And instead of gloating, I got to put my shoulder next to his shoulder and raise up the donkey. What's going to happen to you emotionally when you help out people you hate? You're working together. You're cooperating together. Before you know it, the guy looks at you and says, I thought you were my enemy. And if you were my enemy, what the heck are you doing helping me raise my donkey? If you really were my enemy, you'd do what? You'd let it fall, and you'd probably gloat over it. And if you didn't say anything, I know you'd feel that way, because that's the way I would feel if it was happening to you. But wait a moment. You're helping me out. If you're helping me out, maybe what? Maybe you're not my enemy. Now think about it. I really hate somebody, and we hate each other, I thought. Then I find out in my time of need, he helps me out. I begin to say, maybe he's not my enemy. I help him out. Now, I'm the helper. You're the helpee. So the one who's helped out say, why is he helping me out? Maybe he's helping out because he's not really my enemy. And while I'm helping you out, maybe I don't come it. So the Tosefta says, we do this, lishbor et yitzro. Remarkable expression. Lishbor et yitzro. Meaning, your normal inclination is to get back at your enemy. Your normal inclination is to do what? Is to gloat over it. Your last inclination is to help him out. In the act of helping him out, you may realize he's not your enemy. And if you realize that, get it? Then the guy who's being helped out clearly doesn't think you're his enemy. Well, if you're not my enemy and he's not my enemy and you're helping me out, what do I do when a person does me a good turn? I reciprocate. If my enemy does me my good turn, I begin to think, maybe I was mistaken. Maybe he's not really my enemy. Maybe I interpreted it wrong. Because if he really was my enemy, he wouldn't be helping in my time of need. After all, who on their own can pick up an ox or a donkey? You need two people on both sides. One for him, I'm going to fall. So suddenly I realize maybe he's not my enemy. And he realizes I'm not my enemy. So by extending an act of good, I overcome my natural inclination to get back at him. In the end, what can happen? We could become friends because we misinterpreted each other. Now, this remarkable story goes back to the story of Aharon. When Aaron dies, it said that all of Israel mourned his passing. It doesn't say that about Moshe. With Moshe, Israel mourned. With Aaron, all Israel mourned. So the Midrash says, why all of Israel? And I say very simply, Aaron was an Ohev Shalom v'Rodev Shalom. How did he pursue peace? When he saw two people who were one time friendly, and one did not meet the expectation of the other, and they get angry at each other, and there was a falling out, he would walk up to one and say, you know, the other guy really feels bad what he did to you, but he's too proud. He's not able to come and ask you for forgiveness. Then you go to the other guy and say, you know, the other guy, he really feels bad for having hurt you, but he's really too proud to initiate the process of forgiveness. So now both people think their own pride is preventing the reconciliation. So the Midrash, when they met each other, they started making excuses of how they should have helped each other out. So what was he do? He was Oseh Shalom. He took two people who perceived each other as enemies, changed their behavior, changed their attitude toward each other, and they became friendly. And he even did it, according to the Midrash, between husband and wife, which is, of course, a lot more difficult. Each one, but the other one did not meet their expectations. And instead of accelerating good, it accelerated to bad. He'd go up to the husband and say, your wife didn't really mean it, let me tell you. And he'd go to the wife, the exact same thing. And in the first time they met, each one thought what he told them to think, and they began to look at it positively rather than negatively. So what did it bring about? Reconciliation. So this idea is a remarkable teaching in Judaism that is more focused on the person who hates than your normal friend. In fact, the same verse appears in Deuteronomy, and there, instead of saying your enemy, says achicha, your brother. So the Tosefta asked the question, okay, now you're walking down the street, and you see two donkeys falling under the burden. One belongs to your brother, one belongs to your enemy. Good. There are two mitzvot. Which one takes priority? Should I help out my friend first, or help out my enemy? So the Tosefta says, remarkably, you have to help out your enemy, because both are mitzvot, but helping out your enemy helps you out you. You learn to overcome your natural response to reciprocate. What does reciprocate mean? You treat others as they treat you. Those who treat you well, you reciprocate. Those who treat you bad, you reciprocate. And he's arguing, if I treat well the person who normally treats me bad, we will restructure our misconceptions of each other. Actually, how can I think you're bad if you're helping me out? And when do I think this most? When you help me out when I'm most in need. When am I most in need? I have a donkey, I put a burden on it, and suddenly what? It begins to fall. And I know alone I can't pick him up. Suddenly my enemy shows out of nowhere and starts helping me out. I have to change my preconception of him. I think you're X, therefore I expect the behavior of Z. But if you're not X, the behavior will be Y. And before you know it, if I treat you better than you expected to be treated, you will end up treating me better than I expect to be treated. And we move from enmity to enmity. So it's a remarkable turnarounds of two things in the same parsha. One is the institution of slavery, undermining it, and underscoring that freedom is a divine obligation, and a person who forgoes his freedom in Judaism is a marked man, because he's rejecting the opportunity for divine sovereignty and imposing upon human sovereignty. The other way of being under control is not the slavery physically, but to be slave to one's passions. And one of the best evidence of that is always getting back at your enemy and gloating over your success. And instead of gloating over the success of your enemy, the Torah asks us to seek behavior which would transform the enemy into a friend. And therefore we say, Chaverim Kol Yisrael, to bring about a situation among the Jewish people where people reciprocate good, then reciprocate bad. And therefore we start, says Mishpatim, even before we get to Sefer Devarim, with your enemy, and then we go on to your brother. And I assume the goal is to make of your enemy someone who's comparable to your brother. I think it's remarkable two teachings from Parshat Mishpatim. I think we now have gone through both of our presentations. We'd love, Mashe, right, to entertain questions.
Yes.
We have the Hasidic interpretation. We have an alternative interpretation. We also have the significance of Purim and Simcha. So any of those three issues, which you'd like to either make a comment, raise a question,
Yes,
or say something in general, more than happy. Yeah, Mashe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, Shikoch, that was great. And I also find that our class is a very interesting one, because normally, what we put out is Pshat first, and then Drew, Rem is Drew Sod. By us, V'nahapachu is that place. We give the Sod and then we give the Pshat. But I thought you did a great job. I think it's fair to say there was more than just Pshat there as well. So Shikoch to that. And by all means, everybody can open it up. You have questions about Simcha, you have questions about slavery, you have questions about donkeys, enemies. We covered a lot. So it's your turn to ask any question you'd like.
Make a question or reflection. As I said last week, 2 weeks ago, sometimes the first person is embarrassed to go first. With the second, we just move forward. We should have no problem. I just want to make one comment about Mashe's, that the appreciation that Torah is a polysemous document means it operates on multiple meanings. So we mentioned two, Pshat and Sod, right? Pardes, but this belief that you can reduce a Torah text to a single meaning without hearing its reverberations and different ways of interpretation. And the interpretations are not exclusive, but they enrich each other. It's one of the primary Jewish ways of studying, that you don't reach the Torah to a single understanding, but try to maximize its meaning. And Mashe always makes the point to maximize its application to regular life.
Right. Says many times, we have almost every single item in Judaism, especially when it comes to learning, there's always difference of opinions. We have even throughout the Talmud, different rabbis that would literally spar on every single topic. You have Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Kiva. And then, of course, it would say, Elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim, that each one has its merits. Each one is part of God's word. So it's important for us, and we have the luxury, maybe after all the discussions and all of the rabbis and the Hasidic rabbis and the Kabbalists and the Zohars, to bring out different things, to really connect with what works. It doesn't have to be one way. If you learn a parsha from one particular website or one particular sefer and you're not connecting with it, go find another one until you connect with it. But there's certainly opportunity there. Shivim panim LaTorah. So don't stop until you find the one that connects to you and your soul, and that's the most important thing, to grow with that. I see a moving Kimelman all the way. Avi, slow down. You're making me dizzy.
I apologize. I did actually have a question as well.
Okay. Avi, are you starting Marvin B'Simcha a little early? You're getting ready for the Layada? What's going on over there?
I'm trying to juggle kids and cooking all at the same time and listening to the great Torah. So
good luck with that. I wish I could give you any tips, but I can't.
What's the question?
The quick question is, if you don't perceive someone as your enemy, but they still perceive you as their enemy, do you still have that same responsibility?
Remarkable question. In other words, if somebody dislikes me but I don't dislike them, and it's probably not even clear to me why they dislike me. Is that correct? That would be the reality?
Yeah.
Well, if the goal, according to Tosefta, is to bring about reconciliation between the two people, the fact that the person dislikes you means he has probably misinterpreted either your intention or something you did. You may have done it for your own purposes. He may have thought you did it against him. And therefore, he what? He holds you as an enemy. So I would assume his judgment is based upon your behavior. Therefore, if your behavior significantly changed, there's a good chance his judgment will change. So if the goal is reconciliation, then it seems to be applicable even if it's only one directional, even more applicable if it's bi-directional.
I'll give you the same idea from a different angle. There's a great Yiddish Hebrew expression, and it goes like this. It says, "Vasefelten hasbara, felten havana," and it's not necessarily used in terms of the example that you gave, but it could apply there as well. Again, "Vasefelten hasbara, felten havana." What lacks in delivery lacks in understanding. So let's say we're in a class together, we're all sharing and learning from each other. If someone didn't understand something that I said, or I don't understand something you said, so it's usually not your fault, but it's my fault. If I couldn't deliver it the right way, that's probably the reason why it wasn't received the right way. And I think that can go for relationships as well. And that's something that we need to continue to work on. This is the hardest one, Avi. You always ask the tough questions. And certainly it's much harder. It's easier to talk about it, but to put in practice. I'm sure everybody here has that person that, we need to work and smooth things out with. But ultimately, according to what we just learned today, something is definitely there that the burden is on us to make the other person come around and become from our enemy to our brother. Not an easy one.
Any more reflections, comments? Let's hear some comments. What do you think? Well, let me ask you a question. If you saw two donkeys falling under their burden, and one was your enemy and one was your friend or your brother, and by the way, even the slave, interesting enough, in Mishpatim, is referred to as achicha. It's a remarkable phenomenon that a slave is still called what? One of your brethren, and treated accordingly. But if you saw on your own two donkeys, come on, and one was falling under the burden, who would you help you out, your friend or your enemy? I know myself, I'd be naturally inclined to help my friend. And I probably would see my enemy's donkey and say, boy, this guy's getting what he deserved. But what do you think? What would you help out first?
I'd call AAA. I'm out.
I've got a good solution. If you first help your friend and then the two of you help the enemy, that makes it easy for three people.
Oh boy, sounds like a Hasidic Rebbe you're talking. Okay, so what you're telling me is help your friend first. Yeah, but let's say that seems you have time. But if both donkeys are falling and helping one, the other's going to fall. I would say it's the rare individual who has the emotional presence of mind or ability to make decisions and long-term effects to help out his enemy first before he help out his friend. I think when Chazal say this, it's just remarkable. And of course, the mere fact that Chazal say it imposes upon us an obligation to consider that possibility. Because if they didn't say that, I know on my own, I would never do it. But I was one time faced with a situation like this, it's remarkable. And I remember what Chazal said. And I said, okay, I'm going to do it. But I tell you what, I don't want to do this. I mean, and it didn't exactly work out that well, I got to tell you. You like to say everybody lives happily ever after. The other guy, he didn't really understand why I was helping him out. And it just never clicked. In the meantime, my friend was resentful. How come you didn't help me out first? Okay, it doesn't always work out. And not everybody reads Chazal and knows how to respond accordingly. Nonetheless, it's an interesting situation to be in.
And no good deed goes unpunished, and it's never
no
easy.
Good deed goes unpunished. Exactly what happened here. Okay, other comments or reflections? Come on, we always get some good comments from people.
Okay, so say l'chaim. Maybe people are ready to say l'chaim.
Anyone have a comment or a comment on your own on the Parsha?
Okay.
I have a
comment on your own on the upcoming Simcha of Purim.
I have a comment quickly. Hi. Yeah, we're talking about this on a very macro level, like person to person. I'm wondering if you can think about it on a macro level, like as a Judaism as a collective people. and maybe that can affect anti-Semitism in a way, or maybe the United States helping another country that we might see as an enemy, or Israel's enemy. Should Israel, step in and kind of, thinking about it like that, instead of like person to person, but as a collective, or as in terms of countries.
I'll
Yeah.
yeah. So Isaac, thanks for the question. It's funny that anytime there's a major disaster, whether there was an earthquake, I think even in Iran or in Egypt, or certainly in Syria, there was issues. Israel was the first one to help, or at least offer to help. So as I could just say, in terms of modern day macro, we see this, playing itself out in real time, even in modern day history. But so I agree with you that consciousness should be there, not just in a micro, macro, and everything in Torah should have both of those two sides of the coin, both on a personal level, and of course, a global level. But I think it has to start from a personal level. And before we move, and I'm not saying they're not mutually exclusive, you can do both, but I think the emphasis, certainly the way I see it, and others go in, is it's hard to impact and change the world if we haven't elevated and changed ourselves. And how do we begin to extend our hand to the greater city, the greater country, the greater countries, before we ourselves have yet to take care of enlightening our own life and smoothing out our own problems that we have? And so, at least for me, I can share that when I learn stuff like we learned today, I always ask in terms of my own personal life. And I think that, once I can get that, then I can share it with the class, and the class can share it with their class. And it's, so I don't think that you're wrong in asking the question. I think it's a good point. And I guess on some level, well, let me hear what Reuven has to say. So
I'd like to give you an example, because it happened a couple of years ago when the Syrians were being murdered by their own government. Many of them were trying to flee across in the Israeli border. There was a great debate in Israel. Should we help these people out medically? Because most of them were injured and they're running away, and they wanted to cross the border, and they wanted to get to the hospitals in Haifa. I don't know if you can recall this, but there's a great debate in Israel. Should we do it? And the argument like this: well, if you heal him, he'll go back to Syria, take a gun, and kill you next time around. The alternative argument was publicly said in the newspapers: well, we are Jews, and if the enemy is out and he's no longer a threat to us, and he's injured, we have an obligation to help him. Now, it turns out that those who were helped in Israeli hospitals in Haifa did not tell people where they were helped out, because they were told that if they received Israeli help, they would be killed. Nonetheless, I will bet we're going to find out in several years from now that we planted the seeds of kindness. And while people in Syria may not publicize it, I wouldn't be surprised in years to come, you'll find people who end up doing good deeds to Israel, saying, when I was really in need and I was injured and my fellow Syrians wouldn't help me out, and I went to the hospital in Haifa and I came back. So your argument, I think you don't immediately see the benefits. And Moshe's argument, when Iran had the earthquake, Israel wanted to send them thousands of blankets, and they refused it. Interesting phenomenon. Nonetheless, we did it. And we've done this, by the way, in Israel over and over again to countries in Africa. The number of examples is amazing. And so I would argue that if you have to make a choice, plant the seeds of kindness. We won't always reap the benefits of it, but it's worth it, as long as it doesn't endanger us in the process. The other thing is amazing, is how Israel has gone out of its way to help out Egypt fighting terrorists in the Sinai. Now, there are about 1,000 terrorists. Egypt has a 1 million-man army, which shows you, by the way, how competent they are. But over and over again, they've been helped by Israel to fight terrorism in the Sinai I'm talking about. These are anti-Egyptian terrorists, also anti-Israeli terrorists. I cannot help but believe that the solidifying of relationships between the governments of Israel and Egypt, besides the oil and the gas, which is flowing between the two, is based upon, you did me a favor. And most people, if you do them a favor, they may not do it publicly, feel obliged to reciprocate, because most of us live quid pro quo, meaning if you help me, I feel indebted. I may not publicize it, as some Arab countries were, but I think we're going to see the benefits of this. And I think the best example is what has happened in Morocco, not to the other countries, which is a different relationship. And I wouldn't be surprised in the long term, not in the short term, we're going to reap the benefits of reciprocating kindness, even to enmity, as long as it does not endanger us.
Thank you. Those are two really great answers. Thank you so much.
Okay, any other reflections or comments? Especially at Purim. Nobody has a question about Purim? We'll deal with the next session pretty intensely.
Yeah, one more question, comment. It's Rafi, but Lauren has a question.
So Rafi and I were debating this a little, and I think that, at least for me, there's a perspective that good should be good for the sake of doing good, should be done for the sake of doing good. That there shouldn't be a expectation that in the long run that something good will come of it. I think that in terms of doing the right thing or doing good or helping your brother, that you should look towards like using a framework like Kant, using the categorical imperative, that if you want to uphold basic dignity and human rights of someone, that you ought to act in such a way that everyone has basic things, or that is, everyone is treated with in a certain way that upholds and their dignity and human rights, if that makes sense. So I think that working under that premise, that if everyone acts like that, their conflict would be minimized, and I think that's like a more pure sort of relationship between people.
Hi, Lauren. Good to hear you. Hope everybody's doing well by your side. So let me just take a quick stab at that. So, you said if everyone works like that, then then everybody wins, right? So the question becomes is what happens when everyone doesn't work like that? And what happens when, we've seen it in modern day history, that there are many of, let's just say, the not greatest friends of Israel will utilize Israel's hospitals and medical advancement to be healed, to later come back and, plan terrorist attacks. It's very, very hard to be, I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I'm saying that the question and the challenge is a great one. Do we still go ahead and minister help to those very same people that perhaps one day, as history has proven, or certainly there's a pattern that will certainly come back to haunt us and hurt us? And that's when the question becomes. So we don't have the luxury at times to say, let's just help them now, because right now it's the right thing to help someone. But ultimately, you're right. Ultimately, that's what the Torah is asking of us. The Torah is asking of us is to take the higher ground, and even though it's your enemy, do what you can to change it for right now. So you're right that we should look at it in the moment, but I think we'd be fooling ourselves to not see what tomorrow brings, and at least not make that decision, without that in mind is very hard to do. So I'd like to hear someone else respond too.
It's this, we're discussing. I see there's your enemy, and there's an enemy who just wants to, you don't like, and there's the enemy who wants to kill you. And there are different types of enemies, and I don't think they should be put in the same category as just helping a person whose donkey broke down or fell down, because Israel's dilemma of whether to kill, like Rabbi Schwartz said, that you're trying to heal a terrorist that tried to actually kill you. I don't know if that's falls in the human dignity. It's just to me, it's a different category.
So that's why I said, as long as it doesn't endanger you, you gotta be very careful. Now I'm quote based upon, if you look at the verse in 23:5, it says, Azov tazov imo. You can help him lift the donkey. So one commentator says, as long as his hands are on the donkey, which means he can't hurt you. You get it? But you're not allowed to be an idiot, meaning he may use you helping him out, and he uses the time to what? To exact revenge. So first you have to see whether he's lifting the donkey, and make sure what? That all his effort is in lifting the donkey, and he doesn't have a free hand to strike you. So the question is, you got to be kind, but you don't be stupid. Therefore, I emphasize the phrase, as long as it does not endanger you. Self-protection is also a mitzvah. Chayecha kodmi. It's very important what the point you're making. I agree with 100%. Okay, I think we have any other final comments? Anyone want to make a closing comment?
I want to say yashikov to everybody for joining. Continue to do the learning. You don't have to wait every other week. You could do it every day, and we should do it every day to stay plugged in, never to be alone, to increase with joy. Say l'chaim, help your neighbor, help your enemy. Let's make this world a better place. And don't be a slave.
Amen. Amen. 3 amens.
Sei gesund, everybody.
Sei gesund, stark. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Have a Adar Sameach.
Thank you.
Chas Adar.
Chodesh
Marvin
Tov.
B'Sukkah.
Chodesh Tov, everybody. Tomorrow
Amen.
night. Rosh Chodesh.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.